Oh yeah, take your time.
All right, you're good to go. Sure.
Awesome. Thank you. All right, welcome everyone to the Wallet Interoperability Special Interest Group call for October 13th, 2025. Today on the agenda, we will hear about OAuth and other protocols from Tim Bouma. So thank you so much for joining us today. Looking forward to the discussion. Let's see, we are recording this call. It will be posted on the meeting page later today. We are following the Linux Foundation antitrust policy and the Open Wallet Foundation Code of Conduct. Let's see, in terms of some quick announcements, we are not meeting next week because of IAW, but in the weeks after that, we've got a great lineup of topics. We'll hear about Credo, an update from our the Credo high level that we got way back in January. So looking forward to that, as well as we'll hear about the UDI business wallet from folks from Spherity. We'll also hear an update on the Hyro did identity integrations with open wallet projects, also the DCC learner credential wallet, as well as WeBuild and organizational wallets. So lots of great things today and coming up. Let's see. I know, as I said, IW will be tomorrow, as well as the Agentic Internet Workshop afterwards. What other announcements do folks have?
Shar, I don't believe it appears in the project updates below, but on the Credo team call last week, they're pretty close to landing a plugin for connecting Credo wallets to Hedera Hyro networks. I'm going to put the
Mhm.
link into the chat so folks can check it out if they want. I might be wrong. They may have already landed it. I know the PR was out last week. But yeah, so great team, and they're going to appear in November. Um, we only have, oh, and the second thing is we only have 3 open slots for this call through the end of the year. So if you'd like to present, if you'd like to share your work, if you'd like to talk about what you're doing, reach out to Shar or Bo or myself, and we can talk about getting you on the schedule. And I'm going to start adding dates in January for more topics to discuss. That's it for me. Shar, you're up.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sean. Yes, lots of great things coming up. Let's see. In terms of other project updates on Akapi, the Canon PR was merged in last week. That's super exciting. It's a new Akapi profile that acts as an alternative to Asker storage for everything but key management. So let's see. All right, let's see. Are there any other project updates that anybody would like to share, or announcements or introductions if you're new to the call and would like to speak about what you're interested in or working on in this space? Now would be a great time. All right, let's see. With that, I will go ahead and pass it over to you, Tim. Thanks again so much for joining us.
Great. Can you hear me okay, Shar?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks for having me. This kind of, I forget who reached out to me about a month ago or so and said, "Hey, do you want to do like a presentation or a discussion on uh, specifically a post that I did on Substack on OAuth?" And I said, "Sure, okay." And I'm happy to go through that post. I don't have any fancy PowerPoints or Google Slides or anything like that. My preference is to just have a discussion and more importantly, kind of a dialogue. Um, just for those of you who don't know me, I've been in this space for a long time. Um, with the identity, what was called identity and access management, like going back to 2004, 2005, and when I was within the government of Canada at the time, I was one of the key people that articulated the strategy of what we called cyber authentication renewal. We had a very expensive proprietary system that was built by a consortia back in the early 2000s. Um, and it started in the early 2000s. And by the time I came on the scene, I think that would have been, oh my goodness, 2004, 2005. It was horrifically expensive, and we needed an approach to go to a standards-based national authentication system. And I was with the Office of the CIO, which was part of Treasury Board Secretariat, and we developed a strategy where we outsourced the authentication piece only, not the identity piece. And I was responsible for writing the policy frameworks. A lot of the original policies and standards that I had developed. It came out of preceding work, of course, like the 4 levels of assurance, for example. That was a concept that started to develop in the late 90s, early 2000s, and we formalized that into identity assurance levels and credential assurance levels. And then you saw that evolve to like what like NIST has, like the Federation Assurance, Identity Assurance, Credential Assurance. You have the EU, I forget what their levels are, this low, substantial, high, and really really built the policy framework, which then evolved into what we call the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework. And I'm sure many of you folks are familiar with that. And that basically was the primary instrument that we used to onboard in the federal government, the government of Canada, onboard the province's authentication systems. We were successful in bringing in Alberta and the province of Alberta and the province of BC. And I know, I've moved on since, but they're looking at bringing on Quebec and Ontario as well. That'll eventually occur. So I have a pretty deep experience in this stuff. And then I think around 2016, 2017, some of these newer concepts started to pop up of verifiable credentials with the W3C. And then, just by virtue of the work that I had done, I had a very close working relationship with my US counterparts. You probably know Anil John. I worked with very closely and kind of replicated his program, which is called the Silicon Valley Innovation Program, which he stood up or was responsible for. One of the key people to develop that program to really move forward, like the concept of verifiable credentials, and really to support the W3C work into the government context. I did a similar thing within Canada. We had an innovation program, Innovation Solutions Canada. I put together a program for what we called at the time user-centric verifiable digital credentials, and had a bunch of vendors actually funded a bunch of vendors to develop initial solutions and then demonstrate the viability of that. And that program continue to evolve. And what's really nice is that where it's at today, like the government of Canada, or there's a organization that's very similar to I don't even know if they're still in existence anymore, 18F in the US. And they've moved this forward into like a request for a proposal now for what they call GC, Government of Canada Issue and Government of Canada Verify, and also involved with taking the work we did the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework. And what happened 3 years ago, I was invited to go out on what was called interchange. So stepping outside of the Government of Canada, I went into an organization called the Digital Governance Council that is an accredited standards development organization, accredited by Standards Council Canada, which in turn is recognized by ISO and in turn recognized by all the standards development organizations across the world, if you will, and took the work that we did in the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework and just very quietly and very diligently put that into a national standard or a series of national standards. 103-1, which is digital trust and identity. 103-2 was for health. 103-3 was for credentials. And then we have another one called 103-0, which is more like a practice guide, and got that all published and accredited um, by our National Standards Authority. Very, very quietly. We didn't make any media hoopla or anything like that. Just very diligently um, put the put those documents out. So, why am I talking about this? Is that I have a very long-term view. The majority of my work is around strategy and policy, but I like to keep sharp on technology and have been a better part of 5 years now. Decided to go back to my engineering roots and have been actually working on some open source projects just very, very quietly. I've got a couple that are on the go, and we can talk about them later if you wish, but it's given me some really interesting insights in kind of the state of the industry and where things are going. Also heavily involved with there was a recent project that just came to light with the European Union, which we did a study to look at the European regulations, the IDAS regulations, the implementing acts, and vet that against the model law on cross-border identity and recognition, UNCITRAL, the UN Commercial International Trade and Law Organization. And I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, I was part of the Canadian delegation, which I didn't actually get a trip to Vienna or Manhattan, but I participated online at very unreasonable early hours to represent the Canadian view of the development of the model law. And we had myself, we had some law professors and some representatives from industry. And it was kind of cool. We actually kind of went into caucus with the State Department at the time. I think one of the familiar names you might know, like Tom Smedinghoff, was one of the individuals that was doing some stuff on behalf of the State Department, as well as Department officials, to basically come up with our position on a lot of the articles that were being drafted, and to either complement or to moderate some of the positions that were coming from other organizations. Like, we had everybody, China, Singapore, we had the European Union, we had, you name it, we had everybody that from around the world to develop that model law. So that was really, really interesting. What I liked about the model law, just witnessing it firsthand on being developed, was that this was a real crucible of taking, different legal systems, different cultural traditions, different societal values and perspectives, and put them into, trying to come out with a model law that actually serves the globe, if you will. I also do have experience with another project related, not digital identity per se, but with digital trade documentation, the model law on electronic transferable records. That was published in, I think, 2017, and I worked with the International Chamber of Commerce to develop a self-assessment framework, and then also set up a conformity assessment program to actually not certify per se, but to verify the reliability of systems that are involved with digital trade documentation. So the digital trade documentation is like, you're doing global shipping and you have electronic bills of lading or warehouse receipts and stuff like that. And, whoever controls the document has title to the container. That's basically the idea. And you can issue the document. The document can be in possession of other individuals. Whoever has title to the document can transfer title to the document. So it's really interesting to be exposed to that space, which was around the authenticity and rights associated with the document, as opposed to an individual. And Yeah, and then I'll talk about it a little bit later, but then I got involved with some newer decentralized protocols. You may have heard of Nostr. It really got a real supercharge about 3 years ago when Jack Dorsey basically moved on from Blue Sky. Well, moved on from Twitter, moved on from Blue Sky, and started to endorse Nostr. I also got involved with another open source project on eCache, Xiaomi eCache. Literally at the beginning of the days when somebody decided to kind of revive not so much David Schaum's work. He did the original, blinded signatures back in the late 80s, early 90s, but then it was revived again in the mid 90s for taking the techniques and applying it with elliptic curves. And then fast forward it to about 3 years ago, someone said, hey, maybe we can actually build this same scheme on the Bitcoin and Lightning Network. So I've been involved with that space too. So those projects have really given me some insights into what what we're really trying to do, and also has given me a longer term view of what was the great solutions at the time, and but things have moved on. The environment has changed, and so some of the you know assumptions that we thought were foundational up until about maybe 2, 3 years ago are no longer foundational, and we have to start thinking about what the next generation is. Um, so why don't if I can share my screen, I'm just going to bring up my Substack post on the why I can no longer support OAuth. I'll go through that and quite happy to entertain like sort of the technical discussion in that. And then I've got some other posts that I can actually bring up and kind of share some of my insights. But why don't I just stop there and just open the floor and just solicit any comments, reactions on kind of my opening crescendo there. See if it makes sense, or am I talking out of line, or I'm just curious what people have to say. Oh, can I hear anyone?
Looks like Jim, you have your hand up.
Yeah, sure. Just Tim, yeah, thanks. I've been following, I guess I'll say your work and involvement for, I don't know, 9 years or so in this
Oh my
space.
goodness.
Yeah, right. So look out. I'm behind you. I'm checking everything you've done. I know where you had lunch. I know what's going on. No, but no, you've been a massive contributor, obviously. So I did a digital identity SSI project for the state of Rhode Island, but in a sense, I did admit to everybody that I stole all the work that you and all of the parties in British Columbia and everybody else had done because it was all
Okay.
good and it was all usable. And you were all nice enough to not only donate the open source stuff, but more importantly, when I had lots of questions on G, explain to me, the implementation challenges, the scale, all those kind of other questions. There was tons of help from everybody. A lot of people in this group helped me, but certainly the work and you, John Jordan, Stephen Curran, the whole group, even Ontario as well, is very helpful. So, thanks for everybody on that. But I do agree with your concept in general. I'll just make two statements. One, yes, all of this stuff does evolve and mature. There's no static point that says we got it right. It's an evolution. So hopefully, if you've done well, the next stuff you're doing builds off of the foundation work you've already done. I don't mind that things change or evolve. That's a good thing. But you don't want to say, oh God, we went up a wrong alley and we have to throw all that work away. That's the risk.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So the other side of it is that I think your directions make a lot of sense. The most important thing, and it still comes back, is we still don't have, in a sense, a strong enough, I'll call it digital identity foundation that's, I'll call it universal in place. So there's
Yeah.
all kinds of issues around that, but there's no doubt that I'll say a lot of the people on this call and a wider community are key to driving that forward. There's no question of that. the whole trust over IP group as well. But all of those things are the people, in a sense, who are leading the thing to a better place. And so, great respect and thanks to all of you that are part of that. I appreciate it. Thanks.
Yeah, let me make a couple of comments before we move on to the next hand. About 5 or 6 years ago, I kind of had this, I wouldn't call it midlife crisis or crisis. I kind of went, you know that there's a comedy where it's basically the one soldier says to the other one, says, "Hey, are we the baddies?" And I reflected on it. I said, "Okay, well, what am I doing? Like the work that I'm doing from a central agency perspective, like, is it actually good in the long run? Like, are we doing the right thing here?" I absolutely did not have the answer, but then I kind of kicked myself off that pedal of like central agency wisdom and just saying, maybe we're not doing things right. We're making improvements in that. So then what I did, I think that was about, it was before the pandemic, late 2018, 2019. I decided, I was a software engineer the very early part of my career, and then I got into product management, I got into policy, and kind of did all the, it did all the high levels, high level, like highfalutin stuff of writing strategies and policies and briefings and blah, 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 blah. And I went, maybe I need to get back to my roots. And then I started to retool myself to dig into the technologies. And I got completely fascinated with cryptography. I got totally, I think it was 2015 when I really got fascinated with Bitcoin from the point of view of how it completely inverted the security models, and started to look at that, and then started to dig in. I like being a hands-on person, and I like to know stuff from first principles. It's always been one of my approaches. Spend a lot of time thinking, what the heck are we really trying to do here? And that's the journey that I'm on. Like, I would say right now, um, we're realizing what I would call an incremental improvement. Yeah, we're going from paper or plastic to digital, and there are some incremental improvements, and that's great. There's some victories there, and celebrate that. And again, one thing I've learned when I was in product management is that if you're thinking about a next generation product, you stay pretty quiet on it until you're absolutely sure you know what you're doing, because you don't want to freeze your existing market. So, the idea is like that's the approach and the advice I've given to some folks, is just saying, like, celebrate what you're doing. You're improving the lives of Europeans, Canadians, citizens, or whatever. You're making it easier for them to have stuff on their phone and that's absolutely great. Like, it's totally great. Like, I'm I just love the fact that, like, I have my credit card on my phone, and I can have my license and that, and I don't have to carry my wallet around, and it's a nice feeling. But then you start thinking, ah, um, starting to see some worrying trends of, it's like Apple and Google calling the shots now on the platforms. Do I really want to have the phone as my kind of passport as I walk around? Um, do I need everything approved by the App Store? Does the state have to be in the middle of everything? Like, I'm involved in lots of transactions with, like, not-for-profits, churches, etc., where the state has no business being in the middle of it. Yes, they might have to know stuff from reporting purposes, and just starting to think of what might be the post-phone future, future. So that's what I'm doing. So I just want to set in context my thinking with the shorter term victories, the small victories or great victories, to what might be the longer term concerns. So I'll leave it at that. And I see my video has frozen on a really bad expression of me. Oh, okay, I'm back. There we go.
Shall I come in? Hi, Tim.
Hi.
I'm something from the same place as you do. I've been doing PKI since 1998. I was one of the first UK PKI creators. I created a certification authority of the ITU standard, which didn't make any sense at the time. I've been watching single sign-on since 2008. I did a single sign-on project, OAuth 2 project off the standards in 2010. It was messy, the standards were then, and they got better with the OIDC coming up. But I came to the same conclusion you've got in about 2014 that OAuth 2 was dead due to information flow. It can't go backwards and forwards. The Initiation Game, that wonderful film, shows that you should not be doing backwards and forwards information flow. And so we have a patented digital, I have a patented digital identity. You can go and look me up in the US Patent Office for doing non-information flow identity. And we're moving towards sort of like one-time identity credentials. So you do like a use it, throw it away side of things, which allows you to have a completely different view of identity to make it a lot lighter and almost like make it tiny. So I do identity in 100 bytes, and it just works. It's almost like it makes it simple because you're not carrying 4K of certificate anymore. It's not centralized, and it allows you to start doing things. That's me. As I say, we threw everything in the bin to get to this point. And
Okay, cool.
I feel like I feel like I'm being treated like a black sheep here because all the people in this room are following the OIDC and the singles and the verified credentials as if it's, yes, the IETF has blessed it. Doesn't. So what happened? Can you do me a favor? Can you tell me what happened in 2014? Why did we jump from PKI in the IETF to OIDC? There's this blank where they just changed, where Google blessed it because they needed it. The client certificates got killed for PKI because FIDO took over, and there's this like little. I'm currently looking about 2014 when it changed from we're thinking PKI does everything to suddenly OIDC does everything, and there's no reason being why this is case. It's like there's a sudden change of stream, and everything now is blessed that OIDC is wonderful. Google says it's great, and everything is OIDC based. I'm sorry, guys, I'm slight rant here.
No,
So please fill me in, Tim, because I was doing Malta's ID card at the time, so I was a little busy.
yeah. So another thing I didn't mention, back in 1998, 2000, Canada passed what was called the Secure Electronic Signature Regulation. And the idea was like, when a new technology comes along, like PKI, well, PKI had been around for a while. There's a real rush to like put it into a regulatory regime. And so we made, I don't know if I call it a mistake at the time, but we added to I think it was our Personal Information and Electronic Documents Act, we added a secure electronic signature regulation. And we also had a policy, a PKI policy for the government of Canada. And then we found out very quickly that what happened, it was just like the technology was just, first of all, at that time, just too expensive to implement and just too unwieldy, and just changed the dynamics of like the burden of proof, if you will. So what happened, nobody adopted it. And so then we spent, I think it was by 2009, when we did, again, when I was at the government of Canada, we rescinded our PKI policy because it was just too complex, too complicated. And so I think what happened was that there was like what I call like an allergic reaction to a very overbearing kind of regulation and policy regime. Like I just remember like looking at the regulation, and it was like we're specifying like hash functions and algorithms. It's like there's just no point. There's no place to have that in regulations, I think. And then we just found the industry just wasn't following it. And in fact, we had uh, other laws that did the job, the Canada Evidence Act, which gave a lot more flexibility and a lot with little to no technology prescription, and it just works, and that's basically what's in effect. So I think what happened was that the disappointment with the traditional PKI and X519 whatever, saying, hey, this doesn't work. Then what started to really take off were the REST protocols, the representational state transfer, HTTP, like XML, and eventually JSON, and then SAML, secure search and markup, began to win the day, and that was in, I think, you have to help me out here, but one of
It
the
was
big
2010 was about Philip
yeah
Allen Baker did a big paper on it.
yeah
I did a thing called QuickTap for the London Olympics in 2012, which was using it in Mastercard. Um, and there were two papers at the time on single sign-on, one on SAML 2, one was Philip Allen Baker, and one on. All I've got is this SNAPTers. I can't find the paper. So, Tim, if you've got it, please tell me. But there were two papers which were sort of about 300 pages long. They're big papers on SAML at the time.
yeah, and the net of it is all SAML is basically it's assigned assertion
Yes.
markup language. That's what
Yeah,
it
that's
is.
it. Yeah, that's it. It was a very big paper to not tell you much.
And then you had these open source systems. I think it was ForgeRock.
hmm
Um,
There's still the source code for Firefox's version is still around somewhere for the
yeah.
actual original single sign-on in 2006.
So in I guess it would have been 2008, early 2008. That's when I started to write the paper on the what we call the cyber authentication renewal strategy. We wanted to get away from, we had a very bespoke system with I'd have to look at the architecture, but I know X509 and PKI was in there, but it just was brutally expensive, and vendors were making money hand over fist. To give you an idea, like I guess what I can publicly disclose, it cost us $1 billion, Canadian dollars, to do this system, and it was brutal, the expenses that were associated with it. And we had to get off it. So like the only game in town at that time was secure assertion markup language. So we went to like as we said, we separated the identity from the credential, and we put together like an RFI and then an RFP to say, look, we just want to have like authentication from, at that time, really the only online behavior that had really crystallized in terms of doing secure transactions was online banking. And it might not be a valid assumption now, but we were looking at a way to actually having the banks or the financial institutions be our authentication partners. And then we built like a privacy blinding technology. So by the time that assertion reached the services that were using it, they would have no idea what financial institution that it was coming from, because we didn't want to convey that information. So I think then what happened, you know, op, there was OAuth 1, which had it worked great, but they basically the problem with it at the time was that they had the cryptography bound into the token, and then OAuth 2 came along. I think it was 2012, but before that, they decoupled the security, kind of moved it out and delegated it to TLS. And so what happened was that TLS, just making sure you have a secure pipe between the web services and the REST APIs, and that, it was like, okay, it kind of works. And then very quickly from OAuth 2, you had OpenID Connect, which I think came out in 2014. That was like, Dick Hart was the principal author of like OAuth 2, and then Nat Sakamura was the principal author of OpenID Connect. And, building on OAuth 2 is great. Okay. And then when we integrated like a province of Alberta, they were using like a version of ForgeRock, and it was SAML. And province of BC was using OpenID Connect, and the actual technical integration was not that big of a deal, and the federal services could actually handle both the SAML and the OpenID Connect. What our primary concern from a policy point of view was that we wanted to make sure that whoever was on the other end of that line was a real person coming from the province, and that's what we were looking for. And then it was the federal job to actually reconcile that unique identifier that's coming in from the province, reconcile it to, the person on the service record. We clearly kind of made a clear delineation. But, to your point, I just think what happened, it was just a natural evolution, just a confluence of kind of conveniences. TLS or TLS, I forget, there was 1.3 and two, I forget now. I think I don't remember the versions, but that was becoming all pretty much stable now, and these protocols took advantage of it. And again, we were looking for commercially operated authentication solutions, and we saw that at the time it was great. It was great. These REST APIs and those protocols were doing the job. It was getting us decoupled from like proprietary vendor solutions. It kind of opened up the ecosystem, and it worked great. Like from 2012 up to probably up to 2024. And as I said, I like to take the long term. I started to look at this stuff and saying, OAuth is great if you have like a centralized authentication provider like Google or Apple or whatever, and you actually trust them and they can provide those sign-in services, and it's great. And you can actually have like other identity providers or authentication providers, and it does the job. But then you start looking at it more closely, and I think I'm sharing my screen, is that I said, it's a great protocol for bygone times. Great. I like the idea of the opaque bearer tokens, that concept of something that's uniquely generated with sufficient entropy, that, and if it's private, it just does the job. You got some band-aids like PKCA, some stuff to add some additional security. But as I said, you have to trust these third-party authorization servers. And people say, oh, it's not authentication, it's not delegation. I mean, it's delegation. It's not, it's authorization. But you look at these architectures, like the authentication is pretty much combined with authorization, and so there you go. So, if you're using a third party provider like Google or whatever, they're authenticating you and they're authorizing you for a service, and they just know who you are. And then the other aha point that I had was that, and again, it was great for the time, but securing the pipes is no longer good enough. And the dirty little secret with TLS, whenever there's a hop between servers, that data, unless you encrypt it on your own, that data gets dumped out in the clear and then re-encrypted again. So, there's lots of opportunities for like monitoring or kill switches or whatever. So at the end of the day, when I'm sending some data, unless I decide to encrypt it on my own, encrypt my own payload, I have absolutely no guarantee that it's actually not been opened up, monitored, or even modified. It's like sending like an unsealed envelope in the mail. So the other thing, and again, with one of the projects that I'm working on, the open source project, it really took a hard look at OAuth again. I read the original RFC. I used to know the one that Dick Hart had authored in 2012. Looked at that and said, okay, I'm looking at some new approaches where the identifier itself is natively cryptographic. It's basically an encoded public key. And then I realized, oh, I don't need an authorization server. Oh, I don't need an authentication server, because by nature, the identifier that I'm using is actually cryptographic in nature, so I can do a challenge and response. And the identifiers that I'm using not only can sign stuff, but they can encrypt to another identifier. So that means I have guarantee of end-to-end encryption. So, I saw that I could create a new capability with a protocol where the identifier is cryptographic, meaning, it's fancy that it's actually just a public key that has a corresponding private key. It can actually sign stuff, and it can actually encrypt stuff, or generate a shared key that then I can invoke like symmetric encryption, that the other party can actually figure out the key to decrypt. And then the realization that I had is that, you know, OAuth, and that is basically it's just a delegation protocol, and not only delegates like the authorization, if you will, it basically delegates the security to the pipes. And I realized that's no good anymore. And it's fine for the current infrastructure. It doesn't mean we have to abandon it, but I'm taking a long-term view that this is probably a generational kind of change that that we have to move away from. So as I said, like I think OAuth was kind of opportunistic in its development. It said, "Hey, okay, we got TLS. Hey, we got REST APIs. Let's create, this additional handshakes of granting access tokens or granting access uh, grants off and then access tokens and refreshing them and that." And it's like, okay, it works great. And you did the job of not having to share username and password. It's great. But it's no longer about identity and access management anymore. It's about like ensuring like the agency of the user. Like the problem has changed. And I think, when OAuth was conceptualized, it was about secure access, and it's no longer about secure access. It's about preserving agency. And that's where the line of questioning that I'm going down the line, that the problem that we're trying to solve has completely changed or is completely morphed. And I'm just spending a lot of time trying to understand what that new problem is. I kind of take inspiration from Claude Shannon, who was the founder of information theory. He said, you look at a problem and you discard all the uninteresting bits until you come down to the core of the problem. Like what he concluded, like the basis of information theory, like the digital information theory, was all about uncertainty and redundancy. And that was the basis of our digital protocols. And so, I'm just trying to kind of conceptualize the problem from moving from authorization, access, authentication to agency. And that's kind of like I don't know if we want to talk about it in this call, but that's where I'm starting to re-articulate the problem in a new light. And if I just go back, I have another post called The Internet of Promises, which I just published just before the weekend, and really trying to come up with a new way of looking at things. Interestingly enough, I came across Mark Burgess, who did a bunch of configuration management software in the early 90s, and he tried to, he found that the whole command and control kind of approach didn't work or it would break down. And he developed this idea of promise theory. And I'm just reading that book right now, but it's totally consistent with the thinking that or line of thinking that I'm going through. It's not about command and control. It's about promises, and promises can be, when you get in your car promises you that it will get you somewhere on time safely. You can have promises can be proxied by machines. They can be proxied by, well, they can be given directly by other human beings. They can be proxied, that, when you put a piece of bread in the toaster, that it's going to be toast in a couple minutes or so. And if you start thinking in those lines, it kind of inverts the whole thinking model. And I'm just starting to explore that idea. Like I have a real issue with one of the other issues that I have. I took a really close look at the issuer holder verifier model, and I realized, yeah, it's an improvement. But when I really pulled back the layers, it's like, well, it's not that different than PKI and signing a certificate. It's basically something that can be signed, independently verified, and then it kind of got new life with the W3C. And so now you have the idea of verifiable credentials. But if you look at a certificate or JWT or anything that's cryptographically signed. There's nothing fundamentally, what's that fancy word, epistemologically different than what we've known for the past 30 years, 30, 40 years or so. And then the other problem I started to have with that model was that it just seemed to give the issuers and the verifiers kind of special privilege in that model. And then I realized like vendors and governments are perfectly okay with that, perfectly fine. Like if you're an issuer, you want to have special privilege. And if you're a verifier, you want to have a special privilege. And if governments and vendors work together, hurrah, they can provide something that's to the improvement of the holder, which really has no leverage in the game. And like if you're working in a trusted environment, like I don't really have any issue with like it's gonna work in the near term for like most governments. But the problem is that now you're starting to see language about some of the stuff that I saw kind of disturbing me a little bit with the EU discussion. It's like there was a big discussion on revocation. It's like, oh, if someone presents their license to a rental car agency in Europe and the license is invalid, you want to be able to revoke it right away and then maybe even revoke the wallet of the holder. And I'm going like, WTF, like that's really overbearing enforcement. And, in Canada, we experienced that firsthand when we had there was 3 years ago, we had a protest, and all of a sudden we had the Emergency Act invoked on us. And whatever your ideology is or whatever your political leanings are, it doesn't take much for an emergency to a quote unquote emergency come along, and basically then you're like SOL, like totally out of luck. And I don't want to go too much on this, but I just see there's a big trap where, you as a citizen or whatever, you're now at the mercy of like not only governments, but more specifically the bureaucrats of government and the vendors. And 99.99%, that's okay. But it might not be okay in the future. And that's what I'm really obsessed with now. And I'm also starting to think about what's the post-phone future. Like not in the sort of Mark Zuckerberg sense that I'm going to be wearing glasses, monitoring everyone and filming them. It's about, well, what happens if my phone gets seized? Or what am I going to do? And you're starting to see those things in, I think it was in Germany. Someone made a bad social media post and the cops showed up and they confiscated the phones right from the people from in their houses. So, all I'm saying is that I'm taking a long view and I'm just seeing you know, where the good intentions are could be paving a road to hell, and we have to be really, really careful. And I just want to keep my eyes wide open and just look at alternatives sooner than later. Like my take is everything's fine right now, but there's going to be some event or something that's going to happen, and then everybody's going to have to pivot on a dime. And I'm just trying to figure out what we need to do if we need to pivot. Sorry, I'm just kind of rambling here. I'll leave it at that, Shar. Sorry.
Thank you so much. Yeah, let's see, Ramik, it looks like you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I'm sorry about the promise theory, Tim. I've been through this recently. We have JavaScript promising us cryptographic keys, which doesn't help us very much. Um, I've been through promises and they don't work. You end up having to write a layer of sort of like common sense through the promises when you do the promise theory. I promise I'm going to give you £10 tomorrow. It doesn't mean the £10 turns up. It's that's the problem with it. When you're in cryptography, it doesn't hold up at all, is the promise theory. And I'd love it to work, but
Yeah.
I've had so many promises I've lost count, and it doesn't mean I get them.
Here's the thing. Like I'm going through the book quite diligently,
Yeah.
and you can make a promise, but I, as the counterparty, if you will, can make a judgment call on whether I actually on like you're going to honor that promise or not. So
Mhm.
That's the debate. You promise away, promise away, promise me a rose garden, but
That's it.
whether, then I'll say, that rose garden promise from Romac is like, forget it. I'm not going to do anything. So all I'm doing is kind of taking the key ideas there. The other thing area that I really focused on before was there's a lot of good stuff on theory of consciousness and conscious agency.
Mm.
Really good book, Case Against Reality. There's some very practical and simple models that are in there about subjective experience and decision and action. And I'm just trying to take all this stuff and weave that together into a pretty simple engineering model. And again, my training, I'm a mechanical engineer by training, by formal training. So like the idea is that okay, the physicists and the mathematicians come up with some really good theories and some really good laws and operating principles, but I got to get a freaking plane in the air. And I know what my parameters are. I know what I'm doing. I know what I have to do, and I need to get a plane in the air that's going to survive, that's going to land. So I'll take these theories and figure out how to idealize them and apply them in a way that the passengers are safe when the plane lands. And that's where I'm right now, is that I see some good line of questioning on like the promise theory, conscious agency, the cryptographic tools, cryptographic assurance, like mathematical assurance of public-private key. Um, like the ingredients are there, and I'm just trying to come up with a simple model. Over to you, Claire. Sure.
One thing I'm curious about, so banks and financial institutions have had a different approach than using OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect than a lot of other systems, if I understand correctly. So I guess, how do you think that financial institutions should approach this problem and move forward in light of what you shared?
Yeah, I mean, financial institutions have built their systems, and usually they're legacy systems, and they've grafted on like the standards-based protocols like OAuth and OAuth 2 and that. And that's great. And we leverage that with the cyber authentication renewal. They'll just go with the flow as far as I'm concerned. Like right now, the state of the art is OAuth 2, and now all the newer stuff like OpenID for verifiable presentation, verifiable credentials. But I've taken a look at those models, and it's basically, extending, you know, extending OAuth with a few more REST API calls and that. And it works. It's great. And I think you're going to have like solutions that'll work fine and be commercially viable in that. And they'll just go with the flow on that. But just kind of totally looking at next generation stuff and new architectures where there may be greenfield opportunities in either different industrial segments or different countries or different societies, if you will, that might have potential of just leapfrogging. Like the analogy I give is that like when a new house is built, they don't even bother wiring it for phone anymore. They don't put phone jacks in every room anymore because that stuff is completely obsolete. You just expect it, you're just gonna have Wi-Fi and just electricity and that's it. So like OAuth is kind of like the copper wiring that you have in your house for phone, and it works, but there's going to be a completely new generation of stuff coming along.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you. Thank you for your thoughts on that. Bo, it looks like you've got your hand up.
Yes, thank you. When Bank ID came up, I traveled back to 1992 when some insurance companies came to the bank where I worked and asked if there can be a backdoor in our electronic banking because they trust our one-time password, login, and so forth. And when people come into the insurance company, they promised that they will will trust that it's the right guy, and they are even prepared to pay for it. So Bank ID started before internet. It was, as far as I know, the first one on the net that you could use on the net. And nowadays it is totally dominating in the Nordic countries. Something like between 80 and 100 times per year, a citizen is using Bank ID in about 5,000 different services. But the problem is that it doesn't work over borders. It is national in all the 4 countries, and I guess in Canada too. So that's why the state-issued identification credential, as opposed to the bank-issued, which is based on looking at the passport when you open your account anyway. So the route is the same. That's why we need, for the single European market, obviously, to get the state-issued ones that will work across the borders. But that is, of course, only one identity building credentials. Then there are hundreds and hundreds others which are so damn important for the economy and security and the internal market to make Europe one country eventually. So this is the story back from 92 for my part. It's been an interesting journey for sure, but I'm not technical enough to start saying how it has evolved since that time, but all the banks are there in any case.
Yeah, if I can add, we looked at the Bank ID pretty closely, and we're pretty happy with like outsourcing the authentication, but we weren't ready to outsource the identity proofing part. A lot of countries don't have a problem because they're either just have like they're either unitary state or centralized or just 2 levels of government. Like the UK, it's basically just central and like town councils, if you will. But Canada is a different animal entirely. We're very, very decentralized, and the provinces and territories, in some ways, have a lot more autonomy. You'd be surprised. And then the other thing we had taken into consideration, we have about 300 treaties with indigenous groups as well that have full rights to coming to the governance table. And so we had to be mindful of creating an approach that if like a band wanted to do identity proofing, that we at least didn't have any policy barriers in place. So the big lesson I learned is that every socioeconomic context is different, and how the technology is applied is different in those contexts. And you just gotta respect what everybody does.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Let's see. It looks like we are just at time. Let's see if folks have other questions. Let's see. It looks like your article got shared in the chat. Thanks, Jim, for posting that. Yeah, if you want to reach you with more questions, what would be the best way to do that, Tim?
Yeah, I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. It's probably the
Awesome.
best way to get me. Just message me or whatever. It's a social media platform, so I'm not going to guarantee like an immediate response.
Right.
But if I know who you are, then then I'll respond. Like I once had an Australian like message me at 1 a.m. in the morning, and then 30 seconds later said I didn't respond, and it's like I told him it's like 1 a.m. in the morning, you know. But if I know who you are, then probably LinkedIn is the easiest way to get at me, and then we can. You want to continue the discussion, then I can give you my email address and go from there.
Awesome. Sounds good. Sam, it looks like you've got your hand up.
Yeah, Tim, any chance you're going to come to IW and have this particular argument in a session?
I don't know. The IAW's coming up soon, right? In a few weeks' time.
Yeah, it's next week.
Next week, yep.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think it'd be ready for this time around. Maybe in the spring. Like, I'm presenting like a completely alternative view here, and my big concern is how receptive the audience might be. Like everybody's pretty far along, like the W3C DIDs, verifiable credentials, the UD wallet, and stuff like that. And I don't want to be viewed as like raining on a parade. I'm just kind of looking at the next generation stuff. And so I figure like what I'm doing is just I'm gathering my thoughts. Like the Substack here is a way of just kind of formalizing my thoughts, and a lot of stuff I'm not even putting on LinkedIn either, just because LinkedIn gets kind of hostile sometimes as well. So I'm just kind of, I'm just trying to explore stuff and just not, I get it with the vendors. Like I'm not aligned with any vendor. Like I'm completely independent. Um, it may cast some doubt on what people are doing and what the approaches are. And, I'm not aligned to what the government of Canada is doing, which I think is, I'm contributing to it. Not aligned with what the European Union is doing. I'm looking at it all with a critical eye. And so my imperative is to really just do some independent, like creative thinking here, and maybe it'll shake out later on. So probably the short answer is probably not yet. No, maybe next spring.
Awesome. Let's see. Quick last question from Ramek, and then I think we
No,
might need
it's
to.
more a quick comment.
Okay.
As someone who's also throwing everything in the skip and starting again or trying other things, Tim, I do commiserate with you because it's an absolute nightmare. I did this. It took me about 5 years to get something up, and I'll reach out to you on LinkedIn because I think that's probably the place where we can actually talk more, because I know your pains and I know the fact that everyone is going to OIDVC and all that stuff at the moment because it is usable, but it's not the only. It doesn't seem to be the right answer to me either, and hopefully we can find something better because it looks clumsy at the moment is all I'll say, because you feel like a layer cake with this stuff at the moment, which I do allow you to use. I sort of squint my eyes and hope you let you use it, but myself I have the same feeling as you, which is surely there's something better, and that's the feeling I have. But it's just let them. I don't mind people playing with OIDC and VC, but surely there's maybe something neater and more elegant than this.
Yeah, exactly. And we didn't get into it today.
I'll talk to you on LinkedIn. I'll reach out to you on
Yeah.
LinkedIn, Tim, because
Okay.
I have got stuff which I'll talk to you, but not for this meeting. Okay.
Perfect.
Yeah, awesome. Let's see. Thank you so much, Tim, for the discussion. This
Yes,
was
thank you, Tim.
great to dig into these topics. Thanks everyone for joining and participating. Reminder that we will not meet next week, but please join us in 2 weeks to hear about progress in the Credo project. So thank you so much, Tim. Thanks everybody for joining. Have a great rest of your day.
You're welcome. Okay, take care. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.